Hey there, welcome to Head, Heart, and Hustle, the podcast for creatives. I'm Alan Plummer, your host, and as always, thank you so much for listening. Now, anyone with a side hustle or creative outlet can feel isolated from their friends, their family, and others around them who just don't get their passion. That's why Head, Heart, and Hustle exists, to help you feel motivated, learn, and just get a nice pick-me-up of creative energy from other people like yourself. Every episode, I interview a creative individual who doesn't just pretend to be creative. They've rolled up their sleeves and are producing great things because they need to. They know that being creative is part of who they are. Does that sound familiar? Excellent, then you're in the right place. Now, today, we're interviewing Catherine Baab-Muguira. Kat, as she's known, is a writer and journalist living in New York City. She spent time in Richmond, Virginia, Washington, D.C., and a number of other areas. Kat and I crossed paths, ironically, not because we're from the same hometown. That had nothing to do with it, although that was a surprisingly nice coincidence. Several folks forwarded me an article that they found on a website called Quartz that was basically about millennials having side hustles. It turned out that the piece went viral a couple of years ago when it first came out. Kat was the author of it. I was able to track her down through social media, sent her a note and said, hey, let's talk. As Kat and I spoke and realized we had quite a bit in common, including our love of writing, our hometown, and other things, we basically agreed to sit down and do the interview for the podcast. So if you've ever wondered what it's like to be a millennial and a writer in the 21st century in the world of social media and digital publications and what that looks like, this is the episode for you. So with that, let's dive in. Kat, how are you? Thanks for joining me.
Oh, thanks so much for having me, Alan. It's a pleasure.
Yeah, I appreciate it. So as you know, a lot of the folks that I've interviewed on this podcast are people that I actually know. You, however, are not one of them. I actually reached out and contacted you via email because of something that I read online, which we're going to get into in a minute. But let's dig in a little bit. And I always like to start by asking people to introduce themselves. So why don't we just start there?
Sure. So my name is Catherine Baab-Muguira, but you can call me Kat. I have a day job in marketing, and the rest of the time I'm a freelance writer. Lately, I've written for fastcompany.com, Salon.com, The Cut, which is New York Magazine's women's vertical. And I'm also a pretty regular contributor to Quartz, usually doing around a piece a month for them. Right now, I live in Brooklyn. Park Slope is the neighborhood. And I'm just sitting here at my kitchen table with my husband in the living room with the door closed, but he's watching Family Guy.
Nice. I'm familiar with Park Slope. It's been a long time since I lived in New York, but I definitely remember Park Slope. I don't know. It was a little bit pricey when I was there, but that was, 20 years ago. I don't know what it's like now. I like to joke that I lived out in Astoria before it was, quote, Astoria, unquote.
That neighborhood is so hot now. You know, that's where part of Broad City is at.
Yeah, absolutely. I used to live all the way down the last block of Ditmars Boulevard, right across the street from the park. Had a wonderful view of Manhattan, a park across the street, and I had a 12-block walk to the subway, but I always had a seat. It was the last stop on the N&R line, and that was before they even had an express, so that'll tell you something.
Oh, my goodness.
One of the things that I made me want to reach out and chat with you is a piece that I read, and I think it was on Quartz, that talked about millennials and side hustles. And it's funny because I didn't really discover it. I had probably at least 3 different people send that article to me or share it with me on social media and encourage that I take a look at that. One, because I work with a lot of millennials in my job. I have millennials reporting to me. And 2, because of the whole side hustle thing in this project. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because you know what piece I'm referring to. Can you talk a little bit about that and just kind of give our folks a sense of that piece and what kind of the messaging there is and what you wrote about?
Yeah, of course. So this piece came out in June of 2016, and it was kind of this long, tortured story to even get that story placed anywhere at all. I got turned down by some big names, and then I started working with the editor at Quartz, who I had just cold pitched. So it was the first thing I'd ever done for them. And, you know, at that stage, you're not sure it's absolutely going to happen. You turn in these drafts, and it's at the editor's discretion about whether it gets published at all. The funny thing about that is it's the biggest thing I've ever done. It just recently it got me on NPR's On Point show And I've heard from so many people about that piece. I had no idea what a chord this was going to strike with people. I'm so glad it did. And it's made me feel much less alone in my own creative endeavors. But I don't think I understood what a widespread phenomenon the side hustle thing is.
And so the topic of the piece, the actual piece itself, basically gets to, and I'm going to paraphrase, right? So feel free to correct me, but it gets to the gist of the fact that millennials have side hustles primarily because they have to, right? In your verbiage, in your title, it's kind of the idea that that's all they've got, correct?
Yeah, I think it's true. I certainly have heard from folks that it's been their experience. The idea is basically that millennials are obsessed with side hustles because they are all we have, that we maybe had expectations when we came out of school about what we would do for a living full time, and it simply didn't work out. This is because we were coming out of school in 2008 and 2009, and this was a time when a lot of industries were just collapsing, including the ones I wanted to work in, like media, the arts, that kind of thing. So anyway, I think that a lot of us found ourselves patching together some kind of life, and we do it for both creative reasons, like fulfillment through freelance writing or something like that, and also for financial reasons. I've got a number of friends who side hustle directly for cash, very much the reason. My college roommate works for a local government in South Carolina, and what she does in the evenings after her kids are in bed is she edits PhD students' work. And I've got other friends who are yoga instructors or trying to make it as a life coach or a health coach or what have you, but it's not something that can provide a living yet. So they sort of hustle with it on the side in the evenings and the weekends in the hope that maybe one day it'll work out. So in some ways, like the side hustle is about hanging on to a dream that you have that as of yet is not quite viable.
Right. And I think what's funny, a lot of that resonated for me in a couple different ways. One, I definitely get the career aspect of that, right? So I have a very talented millennial who works for me that's got into marketing. She started out as an intern. One of the things we do at my employer is we're a pretty large company, and so we'll develop our talent pipeline through people internally. And this young woman had started out on the phones, kind of paying her dues, basically doing service calls and customer service online for our company, came in and started interning with us and running our Twitter channel. And she had performed so well that it got back to us actually fighting for headcount in order to keep her. And it was a bit of a struggle to kind of make that happen and make that a reality. And, it was fascinating because we had that happen. We brought her on board. Today, she's a very strong performer, very sharp learner, really leans in and does well. But I could tell when her internship was wrapping up, there was this, I think, at least from my perception, this deathly fear of going back. And she had a job. But it was that same kind of mindset of wanting to get into a marketing role and knowing kind of what's at stake and not being able to necessarily control that scenario. And the reason I bring that story up is because this is one person of a couple thousand within our company who come in at entry-level jobs and who are fortunate enough to get that job and are paying their dues, right? Doing that for 18 months or 2 years, and then struggle, even once they get a job, they struggle to kind of get a position in the field that they've studied for and tried to kind of break out of that. And for me, as a Gen Xer who's been through a variation on that myself, I think what's eye-opening is just how many people there are and how many millennials there are who are out there that have those abilities, who kind of aren't necessarily getting those opportunities or don't necessarily get recognized because somehow they don't always fall into that selected group of, people who are anointed or have friends who can help them or do whatever. So yeah, I totally get that. We've even seen it again within people that manage to get jobs, but have to get jobs where they're overeducated, right? Simply to kind of get their foot in the door.
I was just going to say that my brother just graduated college about a year ago, and I have watched this struggle with so much sympathy. It's very much like what you're describing, except the happy ending hasn't quite happened yet.
Yeah. And and I mentioned to you in my email. So the 2008 period reminds me a lot of when I finished, right? So again, I mentioned I'm a Gen Xer. I'm 45. I finished college in 1995, which again, not a good economic period. This was before the dot-com boom of the late 90s, hadn't picked up yet. There were not a lot of jobs kind of in the early to mid 90s. I ended up temping for like 2 years after finishing college. That's kind of where I started learning stocks. I was doing customer service online and taking phone calls for an 800 number 8 hours a day and writing at night because that's what I had a degree in, was in English. And I was in Virginia and all that's going on. And this is during the first, the Iraq war. And I had friends who were in the military so they could pay for college. And they were talking about reinstating the draft. That was a very real fear while I was kind of finishing up undergrad. And so there was this whole kind of parallel, I think, in a lot of ways for my friends and I who went through that. And a lot of us didn't really start to see things open up until 97, 98, when the economy just kind of picked up and boomed. For me, it was really interesting because I went from graduating from college, moving back home with my parents, sleeping in my old bedroom, working 8 hours a day, and then coming home, watching all right, I'm going to show my age, right? Watching Friends and Seinfeld when they were actually primetime television, and then writing for 2 hours a night on an old word processor. And then just kind of creating stacks and stacks and stacks of stuff. And then moving to New York without a job in 97, temping, and then just having the fortunate luck of being in the right place when things just kind of exploded and opened up. But when I see and hear a lot of the stories from people that are finishing up college now, and I hear some of that, I think there's definitely some parallels between folks in my age group and kind of what we went through 20 years ago. What I find interesting and what I think is some of the parallels there is for us, and I certainly can't speak for all Gen Xers, but in my experience, a lot of us developed not only thick skins, but almost this kind of anti-establishment mentality of we have to take care of ourselves and we have to do it on our own. I think what's different about Gen Xers versus Millennials is that we're a much smaller generation. There were much fewer of us. So there was definitely this kind of anti-establishment kind of, we're not going to be acknowledged and given opportunities, so we're going to make our own. And so I know, if you look, I know a lot of people in my age group that even to this day have a bit of an entrepreneurial streak. And a lot of us, I think even those of us in the corporate sector tended to get started on our careers a bit later. I've essentially had 2 careers at this point. Like you, I freelanced for a lot of time in the 90s because it's what I wanted to do. And that was the only way I could make money. And I couldn't make enough to live off of. I completely get that. So I think, and I'm not saying that to diminish the experience of you and your friends, but I do think there's a lot of similarities there.
No, I don't claim that we're the only ones who have gone through this by any means. A lot of what you're describing sounds painfully familiar, especially the various moments of not being able to make enough to live and living in your old childhood bedroom, which I did at least 2 different times. For me, I came out of graduate school in 2008. And that was itself a little bit of a debacle because I went to New Zealand for graduate school. My husband and I were just married, and we decided to take this great big leap. But it was actually a move that we totally could not afford. So I took out a big loan to do the graduate school and then a little bit left over to live. I had this wedding cash, about 10 grand that we blew also in the process of this.
Yep.
I had no awareness of where the economy was going. I was just not a practical-minded person at the time. I'd kind of been in la la land, writing novels and traveling and just, frankly, dicking around. And then so we get back to the U.S. right at the beginning of 2008, and things just start to slowly disintegrate. Right. And we're watching this, trying to get full-time jobs, because we have no money. We're living with my in-laws and we have no health insurance. So it was a really bad situation. And I wouldn't there's nothing cute about it. Honestly, I used to stay up at night worrying. And the part you mentioned about watching Seinfeld, I can remember some evenings coming home from my temp job where I was just answering the phone in a long foster agency, which was very depressing, and then coming home and watching True Blood and crying and drinking wine. So it was not a good time. Very slowly things started to get better.
Yeah.
So I don't mean to portray, life as just this endless bleakness, but, and I do feel like we learned a lot of skills there. Like, I don't know if this is necessarily all positive, but I can take a lot of rejection now,
yes.
which is good in freelance writing because you just pitch endlessly. And of the 10 ideas you pitch and the 10 editors you approach, one of those gets taken.
Yeah, and I absolutely agree. And I also think, so a couple things that I can say. One, absolutely, I totally agree with that. Thick-skinned, definitely, I'm a pretty fucking resilient person. My wife and I have been through quite a bit. And so you learn how to get up and dust yourself off and just kind of keep getting back up. Two, it's also made me extremely kind of grateful. It's influenced kind of my perspective on life in general, in terms that I don't take anything for granted. It's also made me pretty balanced in the sense that even today, I think I'm at a fairly successful point in my career, given that I'm now kind of in my second career in my life. But I'm very cognizant of how much time I put into work, and there's no kind of middle ground for me. Like, if I'm working, I'm working. I'm not there to socialize. But I'm also the person that it's like last night I had to coach my son's Little League game. You know what? I'm like, I got to leave at 4. I got to leave at 4. I got to go. I got to get the field ready. I got to coach. I have to be there for those kids. And when I'm there, I'm not thinking about work. I'm not checking my email. Now, I might come home and check something for a half an hour, 45 minutes afterwards if I need to. But, it's that idea of being present and having that sense of balance. A lot of folks I know, I think once you go through experiences like that, it really, I think if you come out a lot wiser for it and with a lot better perspective than other folks have. I mean, there's a couple of things that I've kind of picked up along the way. I also think that, my sense of success, I don't know about you, but one of the things we always like to ask people is how they define creative success. And that for me has definitely changed given kind of what I've gone through. So like you talked about writing, and making enough to live off of. How would you define creative success?
I honestly think that simply persisting in it is a form of success. I pitched editors for something like 8 years before I started landing national pieces. And even so, I'm not quite where I want to be, but it took a long time to get here. So it feels really good, while from the outside, it may not look like that much.
Right.
I started off wanting to be a novelist, and I wrote 3 novels, and all of them got rejected. And still, I can't place one right now. But the sheer fact that I'm still at this after I've seen people give up, to me, that makes me feel good. And I try to support friends who are in the same position, who are still trying. Yeah. When you put the weight of the world on you, the day job, the making a living, the having some kind of family life, and having some kind of healthy balance like you speak of. So yeah, I think effort and just that consistency, like getting up at 5 a.m. before you go to work on your stuff. Yeah. I really admire that. And I think that is kind of a form of winning.
Oh, totally. Absolutely. Absolutely. And for me, yeah, I think that's awesome. So 3, and you're still at it, right? You get up, you keep dusting yourself off. One, that's right. Awesome. One of my analogies was I wrote my first book. I moved to New York. I bombarded a bunch of agents with it. My favorite rejection letter that was one that came back. And again, I was like 27 at the time. And essentially it said, you have talent. You are a talented writer. You need to live life more. Come back to us in 10 or 15 years. And I was like, oh shit, that was really hard to take at the time. But now I'm like, all right, that's hard to hear, but damn if that's not honest and that's legit. You know what I mean? That's legitimate feedback. But it's hard because that's kind of like the idea of, okay, wait. But, you know, in the moment, it was just devastating. But now I look back and I was like, wow, that was pretty weighty and significant. And what I was really being told, right, was kind of this idea that everything happens in its own time, not because you want it to. And for me, I don't know about you, Kat, but for me, kind of growing up, you get influenced a lot by the visual and societal trappings of success, right? Like we are told what success should look like, right? It's money, it's a lifestyle, it's a car, it's whatever that looks like, right? However you want to define that. I feel like as I've gotten older, that becomes less and less important. As I talk to people who get into their 30s and 40s and achieve a certain level of success. And by success, I simply mean the fact that they are paid to do what they love, right? And if that's success, a lot of those people that I talk to, they get to a point to where success for them is just getting paid for it and enjoying the process. You know what I mean? And focus less on the outcomes and more on the doing. That can sound kind of highfalutin. I get that. But I definitely, for me, it's evolved quite a bit in terms of what I look for and, you know, kind of where I'm at with that stuff.
Yeah, for me too. I think very early on, especially when I just graduated school, I had this idea that if I don't have a published book within a few years, that means I'm a loser and a failure.
Right, right.
And of course that didn't happen, but it made me readjust. And the process of getting rejected so much, I think, made me a better person. It made me less self-absorbed. It made me more sympathetic to others and to realize that I'm not the only one out here who's trying. And it brought me closer to my husband, which is one of the things I really value now. I never want to be one of those people who regards themselves as such an artiste that they get a pass on being a decent person and, you know, contributing financially and all that stuff.
Yes.
So yeah, I think that getting knocked down was in a lot of ways really good for me. I certainly did not relish it at the time, just like you're saying. I remember opening up some of those rejection letters and just being devastated.
Yeah, yeah. And I think the other thing too is that I've learned from some of these interviews is that you always are knocked down, right? Like, so I joke,
right.
There's an interview with a buddy of mine named Rob Muller, who's a musician. He's not a professional musician today, but he was, right? The dude had signed 4 record contracts. He had produced albums for artists. I think he's a voting member of the Grammys, right? But he now runs social media for a pharmaceutical company. He's a great guy. We're about the same age. He and I talked a lot at length about, you know, in the music world, for example, if you're a musician in a rock band, you sign a contract and you're like, oh shit, that's it, right? The gates of heaven open up and everything changes. And he said, in reality, what happens is you're back at the bottom of the pile. Right? Like you've got to prove yourself all over again. You've gone from one level to the next and you've got to redo all that. But now the stakes are higher. Right? So in the writing world, right, there's definitely this competition or this effort that goes into getting a book deal, which is awesome because then you've kind of made that top cut and your book is published and you can go onto Amazon and see your name, or, you know, you can go in one of the handful of bookstores still open in the US and maybe find your book on a shelf. But then you've got the whole start over again from the bottom of the pile there. And how many published authors, right, actually get advertising support and get marketing support to back their book up, right? I mean, you know, there are tons and tons of authors, myself included, right? I've had a book published and I got zero kind of support. I was getting asked to do reads and kind of Q&As at bookstores and at Barnes and Nobles. There was no money in it for that. If I wanted to do it, I had to pay out of my own pocket, get in the car and drive. And I did it for the experience, but there was no freaking money in that. And to me, I had hit a certain point of that was a bar of success for me. I could walk into a bookstore and find my name on the bookshelf. There was no, and monetarily, it was not that different for me from my previous life.
I actually had an experience with this so lately that absolutely shocked me. So we just moved to New York. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that I did was finally meet for a beer this writer whose work I've admired for years. Chances are you've read his stuff. He's had a book published and got quite a decent advance for it. Mm-hmm. And I bought it new and sent it to 2 of my friends. I absolutely loved his work. and he's been a great big influence on me. Anyway, we go out for a beer, and he begins to tell me that none of this has made him endlessly happy and satisfied. It really hasn't made him very much money at all.
Right.
And if anything, there's a lot of downside to it, in that you get a lot of negative comments and a lot of weird emails and that sort of thing. And it's not a magic bullet getting the big book deal. And also for someone who had achieved artistically what I feel he achieved, to find that it blew my mind a little bit, even though I have more of a practical sense about these things. My friend Alan and I always joke that there's no magic bullet, and we have a running list of everything that's not a magic bullet.
You're better off making a list of what is a magic bullet. That's going to take a lot less paper.
Yeah, I really would. I wouldn't have a page yet.
So what was your, so was that when you kind of had that epiphany or that kind of discovery, was that disappointing? When you walked away from that conversation, how did you kind of feel in that moment?
I came home and sat on my couch just absolutely shell-shocked.
Yeah.
It took me several days to even digest it at all.
Yeah. And do you think, and I'm going to play a little bit of devil's advocate here, right? Okay. Do you think that's necessarily a bad thing? Because one of the things I'm a huge believer in is the belief that mass media is slowly dying, right? Mm-hmm. So we know the era of bookstores are over. I love books. Obviously, you love books. There's something real and tangible about bound sheets of paper that doesn't require a battery or an app or anything, right? There's something, and I'm not a Luddite. I love technology, but there's something real and tangible about a book. Typing, layout, print, all that stuff. I love it. But at the same time, I hated, as a young writer, seeking for that external approval. Somebody coming to anoint me and say, yes, you are good enough. We are going to design a cover and put money behind you. Because I felt, like you were saying, I felt like this repetitive disappointment that I went through. And for folks like me who went to college before the internet, graduated right around the time internet was available and you had dial-up and AOL and You've Got Mail and all that kind of stuff, we started to kind of see some of that. And so I spent a lot of my early journalism days in the mid to late 90s running my own blog and writing online, because I found it immensely more satisfying that I could just write something and publish it myself, even if it was short form, right? Or something related to journalism, and just have it out there. A big epiphany for me was on 9/11. We had left New York earlier that year. I had a lot of friends in New York, still on Wall Street in my old space. I was fortunate enough shortly after it happened on 9/11 to get a number of folks on the phone, and I went into journalism mode. I did what most people would do in that scenario, which was interview people and write down what they were saying. And what I did was I started publishing that stuff online throughout the day. And I ran one web page with comments and quotes from people about what was happening in real time. That's how I was processing it. And by the end of the day, some of the stuff that I was publishing was getting picked up by media outlets and used and quoted in pieces that were going online. And I didn't realize it at the time, but what I was going through was this discovery that with the internet and this ability to self-publish, kind of the training wheels were off, and that need for permission was off. Do you know what I mean? And about a week later, I was like, holy shit, I can do essentially whatever else I want. And I can do it on my own terms. And I've talked to so many people who kind of have taken that approach. And I'm not saying that one is better than the other, right? But I've got friends who are television writers and who have gone on to be successful stand-up comedians in New York and comedy writers in LA. We talked about this. And she started out kind of performing on subway cars and, and ended up having stuff on YouTube in the early days and having stuff get noticed. And friends of mine who, started shooting films and having those noticed. And, even with me in this podcast, I would have never done this a year or two ago, but I wanted to bottle the lightning of these types of conversations with people. So I guess my question for you is, has that experience kind of reframed a little bit your approach to writing and publishing, or do you still prefer kind of the traditional route, or do you think it's a balance of the two?
I think for me, I had the idea or the delusion for a long time that there's this special club of published writers and that you must be among them to be legitimate. Uh, but the last couple of years, I haven't really been operating on that idea so much either. The last novel I wrote, I just published for free on Wattpad.
Right.
I have my own tiny litter in which I run friends' essays, people who I think deserve to be published, but it hasn't happened yet. So I just want to distribute it among 50 to 60, friends and acquaintances and colleagues and that sort of thing.
Right.
There's a wonderful intimacy around that. I really love it because I know exactly who I'm talking to, and I'm kind of introducing one friend to another, which I love to do because so many of them are writers and creatives. And the tiny letter is about art and money and piecing this together. So it's like we're all having this long, intimate, rolling conversation. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I've really learned to love those things. I haven't had success with a blog or anything like that. Not tried it. Just everyone starts one once and makes 2 posts.
Right. Exactly. Yeah.
So I did do that. And then, in some ways I've really enjoyed the process of working with editors. So I can really see the other side. Editors who make your stuff better. Gosh, I mean, you'd almost pay them to work with them because they make you better and smarter. Yeah, it's kind of, I can see it both ways.
Yeah. And I'm not in any way, I mean, I'm biased, right? I have my own kind of opinion of that stuff. But you're absolutely right. Editors are definitely helpful. I've kind of, and again, maybe it's the battle scars of what I went through when I was younger, but I have learned through several knocks throughout my life that by and large, nobody's going to give you permission. You know what I mean? Whether it's professionally or personally or anything. And man, my feeling is fuck it, just go and do your thing. And, I get to a point where I'm like, all right, you don't like it or don't tell me no, that's okay. I'll try this other approach. And maybe, but the flip side of that is I didn't have the persistency that you did, right? So you talked about your 3rd book and you're still banging on those doors and you're still determined. And kudos to that, right? I mean, that's awesome. How many people stick with any particular art or any particular ability or space for a significant period of time? The world is filled with stories of almost had beens or could have beens or should have been. So kudos to that. How did you become a writer? Were you a writer as a kid? What was that evolution like for you?
Yeah, I'm a big introvert and I'm part of a very large Catholic family who make a lot of noise. I'm one of 7 children. So I think early on, to distinguish myself and carve out some kind of role, I became the writer-reader, which came naturally to me. That's my personality. That's very much how I absorb information and how I prefer to spend my time.
Right.
So it started very early, and my dad was a journalist. So I was familiar a bit with that world, and he worked for regional papers. And he was a city editor and that sort of thing, actually at the News Leader in Richmond when it used to have an evening paper.
Yeah.
Anyway, so I had this idea to major in journalism school, and I majored in journalism at school, and I went to the same journalism school he did. I ended up becoming an English major because that was really closer to what I really love, just literature rather than journalism.
Yeah.
But yeah, it was always what I was going to do.
Yeah.
And in some ways, that's been the worst thing ever because it can be a real pain in the ass to live with. I'm obsessed with it.
Right.
And a lot of times I'm just in my own world. I use focus view in Microsoft Word, so I'm just literally staring into this white hole.
But it's part of who you are, though, right?
It doesn't seem like it's going to change now.
Right.
But I wouldn't say it's not at all an unmitigated good. I don't know that I would change it, but I do see ways that it makes life harder.
Yeah, I'll compare a little bit. So my son is turning into a visual artist. My 6-year-old son is adopted. So it's fascinating for me to see the nature versus nurture kind of thing. My son already is turning to an illustrator and an artist. And I see kind of, right, the manic in him, right? You know what that's like. You get an idea, you get a spark, you have to get it down, you have to get it out, right? I used to carry tape recorders in my car and spit out ideas and dialogue and things while I'd be driving. I totally get that. My son will get an impulse to draw something, and he'll draw the same picture 6 times within like 20 minutes. And each time he's refining a different area of the drawing. Do you know what I mean? Which is fascinating for me at like 6, and the comparison of his drawings to his classmates. Malcolm Gladwell talks about the Black Swan theory, right? And putting in the 10,000 hours. And that's how the Beatles became great. My son's already putting in his 10,000 hours.
Right.
But he has to get it out. I totally get that. And that's part of who he is. That's part of who he's always going to be. Do you know what I mean?
I absolutely do. I feel such a kinship already with him. Not to be creepy, but I just will know the same joy and the same pain.
Yeah, and he dives right in and he dials it in. And when he can't get it right, he gets frustrated and he gets mad at himself because it's not living up to what's in his brain and what his expectations are. I love it. I love it. And as a dad, it's like, here, papers, crayons, markers all over the place. If he comes home from school one day and doesn't draw, I'm like, Marcus, you okay? What's going on? I want to check in on him. I think it's fascinating. And I think that's how we're wired. And I also think, and I'd love to get your take on this, I also think it's necessary to get a sense of balance. I think it's real easy for most people to become consumers. And I don't mean like financial consumers where we go out and buy a lot of shit. We do that too. But there's just, we're wired to consume, right? I mean, we're reading stuff online. We're watching videos. We come home and watch TV. We have people cook food for us. We go out and buy shit. And it's constant consuming. And I'm a firm believer that in order to get some kind of sense of balance, you have to create something. I don't care what the hell it is. You've got to actually produce something to restore that kind of sense of balance in you.
I absolutely agree with you. I think that doing that helps you maintain your soul. I mean, the fact that you still have one in there.
Right. I was going to say sanity, but soul is yes. That's absolutely accurate.
I mean, since we moved to New York, I'm not familiar with this level of distraction. I mean, I've lived other places than Richmond, right? Some of them very beautiful and very far away.
Right.
But I've never lived with a place that has world-class distraction available every moment.
Yes.
So that I don't have to do any self-entertaining or looking inside myself if I don't want to. I can happily stare out the window or go see a show or go to a new place every hour. So that's been a real adjustment lately where I felt the draw to just become passive and become just a consumer. And getting up and forcing myself to do work when it's nice outside and Prospect Park is a couple of blocks away, that's a struggle. And the first time I felt it in a while.
That's fascinating. I completely agree with you, and I totally get that. And the reason I'm fascinated by that, because your experience in New York is almost 180 degrees different for the reasons that I moved from Richmond to New York, decades ago. Because for me, it was about getting out. Again, right? So think different time frame. Richmond then in the 90s was not the city it is today. A lot of creatives were up and leaving, right? It's pre-internet. We're still relying on mass media. Musicians were headed out. I think the only band worth a damn at the time was Guar, right? They've been based out of Richmond for decades. Actors were either headed off to New York or Los Angeles. Musicians were headed out. I was the writer of the group. Sure as hell, I was going to get out with them. And we all kind of took off. And, for you today, like you talk about getting to New York and feeling almost overwhelmed by all of the distractions. For me, it was almost like I needed that energy, because I felt like I was lacking that. Like I felt the opposite. I felt like I was being creative in isolation and I was doing all this work. And then when you come up for air and want to share your work with somebody and talk and interact and have a meaningful connection, I didn't have anybody to do that with. Certainly not other writers. You know what I mean?
Yeah, you do.
And it's interesting to me to talk about kind of that shift. And I think some of it's just time and some of it's, I think the world is different now. I totally get that. There are times today, right, being outside of Philadelphia, that I feel overwhelmed by media and noise and other things. But I also just kind of joke that it's old age and midlife. So maybe it's not. I don't know.
Oh, I think it's all of us, especially, I mean, if you wanted to, or if you were just totally passive about it, you could read internet content all day long. Like for me, I have to be really deliberate about still reading books rather than just reading internet articles.
Yeah.
In part because I'm trying to seek out the depth and the greater development of thought that you get in 50,000 words over 1,000 words.
Yep.
But for me, I could absolutely go down into a tunnel of that and never come up if I weren't really careful.
Yeah, totally. And it's just the fact that, it's like statistics have shown that use of tablets spikes at like 8 or 9 o'clock at night. So trust me when I say, and as a marketer and as somebody that works in social media for a living, trust me when I say that the vast majority of Americans are going to bed, laying in bed and reading their iPads for 45 minutes or an hour, if not longer, before they turn the light off and go to sleep. Everybody's doing it. Totally get it. Totally get it. You can see it. You can see it in the use of that stuff. Yeah, it's amazing, and how you have to kind of willfully turn that stuff off. There's definitely kind of a disconnect from all that. Totally. So did you play sports or did you do anything else? Was it always kind of writing for you? Did you try any other kind of creative outlets when you were a kid?
I did a lot of theater in high school, and I loved that. High school theater, community theater, that sort of thing. And I briefly thought about majoring in theater in college. And in a way, I wish I almost had, because I think it would have been a ton of fun. I love theater people. Right. I love being backstage and the whole the feeling around those things. But other than that, no, I didn't have any other real creative outlets. I draw a little bit, but hardly much enough to mention.
Right.
So, yeah, it was a maniacal focus for, since I was about 10 years old.
Yeah. So when you think about your writing and what you do today, how did you find your voice as a writer? How did that come about? Which I think is, different from writing itself, right? There's kind of, because I think it's really easy as a writer. You get influenced by people that you read and authors that you like. But eventually, I think as you mature, right, you start to find your own voice and start to distance yourself from some of that. And you become comfortable with your own cadence and your own language and your own dialogue and style. What's that evolution been like for you?
I've heard this go a lot of different ways for different people, but for me, it's very much a process. It's been a process of excavation. Like, I had to dig through all this shit and get all this shit out of the way. Mm-hmm. And really, I mean shit, like it wasn't any good.
Right.
So writing 3 novels was a process of just shoveling that out of the way so I could start to get to some decent stuff and start to hone my voice and get toward what I mean, and also get past a lot of pretentious English major crap that I'm really glad to have said goodbye to.
You got it out of your system. That's what matters.
Yeah, there was a lot of it, honestly. I should get no pass on this because I was in that direction for a while. But anyway, hopefully speaking from the other side of it now.
Yeah, and it makes me laugh because I've got an unpublished novel stored away, and my wife is now saying to me, you should revisit that. You should take a look at that and get that back out and dust it off. And I'm like, it's either a really good idea or a really good bad idea.
Right.
I don't know which. I think in my mind, I think the story and the concept had a lot of merit. I think the writing, essentially in my mind, it's like, well, if the story's worth a damn, at this point it's 20 years old. It's more of a historical piece than kind of a current day type of story. Because the world has changed so much in the past 20 years. But at the same time, I'd almost have to rewrite the whole thing, and scratch over, but stick with the story at this point. Do you have anything like that or any kind of thoughts on stuff like that where you're like, yeah, the story is good, but I'm not, my quality, it's not where I want it to be yet?
I would say that the major thing that I see is my big sin beyond pretentious allusions and references and such in my early fiction is just that it was not very generous in its view of people and their motives. In your early 20s, you just kind of rush to judgment and, everyone is against you, who's not for you. And I certainly don't have that view now. So I could only be glad that it never got published, actually, because I don't think I come across as a decent person, and that's important to me. So it's funny what you say, though. I'm really interested to hear this. Do you feel like finishing a novel helped you develop as a person, like that simple following, kind of like what you're saying about your son, just to realize your vision, however flawed it may be?
You know what it was? It was a couple things. One was it, right, and one was it was therapy for me, right? It was kind of exercising some demons, which we all kind of do in different ways, right? It was very therapeutic for me. I needed that in that point in my life. I needed motivation, right? We talked about jobs and not getting a job. I needed some sense of control and creativity in my life that I was going to do. And God damn it, it was also about getting the thing done. I wasn't in a rush to do it, but there was this amazing, immense satisfaction the day that I finished. And I was like, I've done it. Like, I don't give a shit if it's been published. I've written a book and I can hand it to somebody. You know, and just that sheer moment alone, regardless of everything that was going on in my life and regardless of my jobs and everything else, there was a sense of satisfaction that came out of that I knew nobody was going to take away from me. You know what I mean? And that was just massive for me in my self-esteem and everything else. So yeah, I totally got a lot out of that. And I think there was a huge piece of that. But yeah, I loved it. I loved it. And I've had multiple ideas since then and things that I've started. But it's daunting because now there's definitely that craft of kind of wanting to get down and put the time and the energy in. And now I would approach it differently. And I would do a lot more character studies and I would have a lot more background and I'd have a lot more in it than I did. But like your comment about not being a good person or being, you know, and thinking about that, I think that's kind of what that guy was getting at. That agent was getting at with his comment letter to me that said, live more life experience. I go back and read what I read and I'm not necessarily embarrassed by my characters and by the portrayals of them, but it absolutely is more one dimensional and less, it's definitely more black and white than the way I see the world today. Totally.
Yeah. I mean, maybe writing that helped you get beyond that, because I heard similar things from agents too. But my first chapter, my first novel was all about my childhood, like the intimate memories, blah, blah, blah. And I remember an agent saying, like, why don't you start off with something other people are interested in? Yeah. So, you know, not just spiel about yourself here for 30 pages and then get this.
Yeah. I mean, my whole first book was about getting away and kind of reinventing oneself and then getting success and success not being what you thought it was going to be. It's purely what it was. And I was like, okay, I guess there's, you know, now I'm like, shit, okay. On the one hand, I was pretty much right. But two, I was like, God, that's really kind of trite and arrogant to crank that out at that age.
You know, it sounds like we're onto something now, honestly.
Well, okay. So fortunately for us, right, writing and successful writers, there's no age limit on that. We're not models. We're not, you know, pop stars. You know, we can hit our stride or hit our first success in our 50s or 60s and not even have an issue, right?
Yeah, absolutely. This well-known writer I was out with the other night is 50, and it's only happened for him in the last couple of years. Yeah.
So what do you think has been your greatest success creatively?
Oh God, okay, I will say that I was blown away that NPR and the On Point show Tom Ashbrook, which I have great admiration for, that I was blown away that they thought I was enough of an authority on absolutely anything to have me on air talking about something in my experience. That felt like this weird full circle arrival thing, because I was talking about the absolutely terrible experiences that my husband Chris and I had in 2008 and 2009, being broke and struggling, having 30 grand in student debt and $300 in the bank, and struggling to get freelance writing jobs that paid $100 a piece. After all that pain, to then later be talking about it in the context of an article I wrote that got published, somewhere somewhat well known, that felt really, really amazing to me, and I never saw that coming. So it was just the loveliest surprise.
And it happened for something that wasn't necessarily a direction that you were going to head in. Like your point was, you said at the beginning of our chat, I had no idea it was going to resonate so well and be so impactful.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. You just can't predict these things, which is one of the, I think, the major points of creative life now. If there's a difference between creative life 20 years ago and now, it's because of the internet, you have no idea what a thing is going to do. Like the weirdest little piece that you pop off in 2 hours can go viral or nearly viral. And then a piece that you slave over for 2 months and pour your heart and soul into, may get read by 10 people and die.
Yes. And quality has nothing to do with it.
Yeah. It's just kind of what catches fire or what doesn't. And most things don't, but you really can't see it coming. And I kind of love that unpredictability.
Yeah. Yeah. I do too. It keeps you on your toes.
Agreed. I'd like to see it happen to people too. Like they write a tiny little story for a personal finance website and it gets so viral that a year later they're writing for the New York Times.
Yeah. Yes. Now you talked about kind of the surprise and the awe of being asked to do the NPR thing, which I think is freaking awesome. I love it. Is that I always talk to a lot of creatives who, when you start to have some of those moments, there's a bit of this, fear of being found out, right? Like feeling like a fraud. I mean, I do it. I still feel like that. I go to work every day and I'm sitting there running these things and I'm like, they're going to know that I don't know what I'm doing. They're going to figure out that I have no freaking clue and that I'm winging this. Was there an element of that? Do you get elements? Do you get moments like that?
Oh God, yeah. It's like that you're looking behind you. Like, did you mean me? Or are you waving to someone behind me?
Right. And you know, what's amazing, Kat, I've had people who are television writers, right? Who've had the same thing. People that are successful by almost anybody's definition. They may not be rich or famous, but they're absolutely successful in their craft and they still have that gut feeling.
Oh yeah.
I don't think that ever goes away.
I mean, lately I've been pitching somewhat highbrow pieces about the intersection of art and politics and so on. And I'm always terrified that the person I'm pitching is going to find out that I went to a state university. I'm from South Carolina. I'm not qualified.
Have you pitched a garden and gun? You should try it that way.
Oh,
you've got the Southern angle going in.
Oh, Lord. But yeah, I feel like in some ways, like I don't have the cultural driver's license to be doing this.
Yeah.
I read a lot and I'm a passionate absorber and observer of culture or whatever, like so many other people. But there's definitely, if you were to wait for permission, it would never come.
Right. Totally. What do you think has been your greatest failure, or what's a pretty significant misstep you've had creatively that's been a real learning lesson for you?
God, there have been many, many of those. I think in times where I've been depressed about things not happening, like for instance, after my first novel got rejected all over the place, I think in some ways I would go into a shell and just be a jerk to people around me, which I don't think there's any excuse for. That I regard as a kind of failure when you're letting it bleed over to your personal relationships. But then, I mean, honestly, I've gotten so close with, like, for instance, about this time last year, I got really close with a big print magazine. A friend had put in a good word, and all of a sudden I'm pitching this really highbrow editor. And we go through several emails, and I'm super pumped up about my idea. He's excited. He thinks it's a good idea. And finally he asked me one final question, and I choke. And it doesn't happen. Like the piece just fizzles. It just comes out. So, and from that, it made me drill down So now when I speak to someone, I always have why is this timely? Why should I write it? What's the news angle? All of that worked out in advance so that I don't think that I can just work that on the fly after I'm already in the act of selling.
Right. And it was amazing for me when I started pitching stories. Like, I was never prepared for how much of a hustle it is.
Oh, yeah.
And it was a really hard lesson for me to kind of realize that only about 50% of my time was actually writing and interviewing and creating copy. Damn if the other 50% of the time was just trying to get paid and trying to come up with new story pitches and trying to shop stuff around and get calls returned.
Mm-hmm.
Feeling like a salesman. And I was like, God, I was like, nobody prepared me for that. And I wasn't wise enough or old enough to know how to do it well. So I really floundered with that. So, I mean, kudos to you for kind of figuring that stuff out, because I was clueless going through that stuff.
I mean, I think everybody has to learn through experience. I'm not sure someone could tell you. Honestly, it's just fielding the same questions over and over again and learning to have your answers prepared.
Right.
But and absolutely, it's a sales job in a strange way. And one of the things my day job in marketing has helped me figure out so I work in direct response marketing, where you're gonna say approach 100 people with a sales letter, and a good response rate is when 2 of those people buy. So 2 out of 100. So I'm always thinking in terms of response rates. Like when I send out a pitch, I want one person. I need one yes. A lot of people are going to reject this thing, and I'm not going to let that slow me down. I've got to focus on finally getting that yes, and sometimes that takes pitching 8 places until you get to the 9th. So
yeah, it's totally a numbers game, and I think that's exactly it. I think we are hardwired to forget that and overlook that, right? You weigh on you mentally think about that statistic anomaly or those examples of the overnight success, because as a culture we gloss over everything that goes into that moment.
Oh yeah, but I mean, honestly, one of the reasons I like the episodes of the podcast that I listen to is because I'm deeply interested in the question of how the sausage gets made, because I feel like we so rarely tell the truth about this.
Yeah. And what I'm finding through all these interviews is there's definitely similarities, and there's definitely this kind of kindred mindset among everybody. And I'm thrilled just to kind of be capturing this stuff, you know?
I think it's wonderful. I want people to absolutely just tell the truth, admit to the struggle, because it certainly makes me feel less alone when I hear other people have it. Your friend Cece, who sounded so accomplished, right? She's worked on television shows and does that for a living, which is amazing to me. The fact that she's been fired and had to deal with the fallout of that just made me feel less alone and less as though, I failed that time I choked with the editor.
And she's like, you talked to her about it. You and I joked about this. And she's like, oh yeah, that's a badge of honor in Los Angeles. Everybody gets fired, right? I'm sure with a network of successful writers, I guarantee anybody worth their salt who's written for big publications has had those issues come up. Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. And I feel like especially in this day and age, so many creative pursuits are done in isolation that there's that vulnerability that comes with kind of sharing disappointments and challenges and frustrations. And yeah, and I struggled with that. It's one of the reasons that I fumbled and struggled with creativity so much at a young age. And I think it's actually part of the reason that I ended up in corporate America, is because when things got really hard for me and I got to the point where I was getting married and starting a family, I didn't feel like I had enough of a support system to kind of keep going on with that. And I truly felt pressure to get out of it because it wasn't financially stable, and it didn't feel like a career for me. It didn't feel like something that I could have done for the next 30 years. And so, yeah, absolutely. But what I look at now is like, I try to put on some rose-colored glasses, and I'm like, well, damn if that doesn't make me a good marketer, because I work with creatives and I understand the process and I know how to think about it. And by the way, I could do creative stuff outside of work, and I don't give a shit how many people listen or take that stuff in, because it's not based on monetary need. But it's just been kind of reframing some of that stuff. Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I see a lot of valor and just a quality that I respect in people who go to jobs day after day. It took me a long time to develop the habit. I have a day job now. I've been in the same job for 7 years, and actually, I work from home, but it is a matter of showing up and doing my job every single day and bringing the
Right.
level of interest and just meeting the requirements of it. And it's in part because I have not wanted to hand the whole financial burden over to my husband while I get to play as an artist all day long. It just doesn't seem fair to me, as much as in, occasional fantasies, I would like to see that happen.
Right.
And, my dad made a living while he might have been wanting to do other things. I understand what people give up, but we gain a lot too, especially for the other people around you. A lot of the artists that you read about in the past, not only have they suffered from terrible poverty, they've just been huge assholes to the people around them too. And
yes,
kind of like I was saying earlier, I don't think because you're a creative you get a pass on that stuff.
No.
So, but I absolutely don't judge the day job. If anything, like, I kind of take it as a badge of honor.
Absolutely. It's funny. So I don't know if this made it into the episode, but one of the conversations that Cece and I always have when we chat is kind of, we trade notes, right? The grass is always greener. And so to your point, I go out to visit, I go out to LA, and I'm like, oh, I just want to hang out and catch up and tell me stories, and what's that like, and what's writing for this show like, and you're working with Bill Nye, and I'm grilling her, right? I'm grilling her about Netflix versus like the network television and all that stuff. And I'm so fucking jealous, right? And she's like, but Alan, and she's like, yeah, she said, but Alan, I go from feast or famine. I'm either working 16 hours a day for months on end, and then it all just goes away. Like, that's the nature of the industry. You do that, and then it's gone, and then you're unemployed.
Yeah.
And I got to find the next job, and I don't have insurance. And her husband has a steady job, but she's trying to find her next work and deal with her agent. Mm-hmm. And no stability. And she's like, by the way, we're still renting because we can't afford to buy a house in LA, right? It's like New York, it's the same kind of thing. And she's like, yeah, so for me, it looks very glamorous on the outside, but the flip side is, she'll say to me, you come home, you're paying for your house. You've got 2 cars in the driveway. You're paying for your kid to go to school. You don't, you're not laying in bed anymore at night worrying about how you're going to pay the rent. Because I've gone through that as well. And I don't want to say that I'm not in any way, shape, or form suggesting that folks should give up their dreams and kind of sell out for that. But stability is necessary. Life is uncertain. And to your point, there needs to be some sense of security, in my opinion, without burning out that creative drive, while still nurturing that ability and that desire to be creative.
Yeah, and I think it's always a balancing act, and you're always recalibrating and trying to get it right. I have friends who have what sound like, and seem to be amazing, fulfilling, certainly prestigious jobs in the arts, writers, and I can think of some, like a friend of mine, Becca, is a children's librarian at a combination theater / library for children, and it's so fulfilling. She's the happiest person I know because her day looks like reading stories to children. And when you do marketing rather than that, you can feel so cold-blooded, as though, you're not necessarily contributing in a positive way or something like. So I just think you're always staring at the ceiling in the middle of the night to some degree. I don't know that it's certainly not something I've ever been able to like settle in my mind to any great satisfaction. In fact, I think it's just the ongoing state.
So you talked a little bit about like her day and what that looked like. What does a day look like for you? So that sense of balance, how do you kind of achieve the two now that you've got the job as well as kind of the writing that you're doing and the pitching and the stories? How do you balance the two, especially having some kind of a social life and friends as well as being married?
Right. Trying to have a social life and friends and be married. I'm lucky to have a lot of flexibility in my job. I love my employer. Anyway, though, I get up early. So my husband's more of a late riser, so I've got a couple of hours to myself of drinking coffee And that's when I do my writing. And then say about 9, I'll start to write for work, because that's a writing job as well. And that usually goes, into the afternoon. And at some point in there, I will try to exercise, very occasionally going to a yoga class, mostly just taking long walks. And then in the evenings, we make dinner. We're more people who go out on the weekends and not on weeknights, because both of us are bushed. I want to make sure I can get up early the next day to write.
New York is expensive.
Yes, there's that. Yeah, it's stunningly, terrifyingly expensive. I don't think there's much glamour to it. It probably looks like other people's lives. Like if I get out to a movie on a weeknight, that's exciting. If I stay up till 11 o'clock on a weeknight, that's pretty exciting.
All right, listen, the fact that I'm up after 9 o'clock on a weeknight after putting my 6-year-old to bed, I'm on caffeine and I probably shouldn't be.
But that's how the sausage gets made. Like if I were to stay up half the night being out, which sounds like a blast, and occasionally I will like to do, but I don't get up the next day. So that's a day I don't write. And so much of this, which is not to imply I've achieved any great success, but so much of it is just cumulative, putting the time in every day for years until you start to get somewhere. So I'm really wary of ever skipping a day, which I know could sound dreary or obsessive, but I haven't figured out another way to make it happen.
It's a good point. I think that's one of the things that people who aren't creative overlook or forget, right? You hear a 3-minute song and you don't realize, unless you're a musician, how many hours went into writing that song and recording it and playing around with it. And then, like my friend Rob, editing everything and playing around with kind of the different tracks and the different mixing. And for you to have a story written or a chapter written, how many hours go into writing and revising and editing and tweaking. And hell, even this podcast, a lot of my interviews run 20 to 40 minutes, and that's 1 hour or so of interviewing, but then everything else that goes with the episode ends up being 20 to 25 hours of work per episode.
Right.
And we don't think about that.
I think it doesn't get told. People don't admit to it, and I understand why. You want to maintain the je ne sais quoi or whatever.
No, fuck that. I want people to know. If you're listening to this right now, this did not just, it sounds very natural between you and I, but I work hard on this stuff. And like it or not, I'm you know what I mean? I'm biased, right? But I'm not ashamed of that.
No. I like it when people admit to it. I put way more hours into a story than you might guess. Oftentimes, more than a dozen or 2 dozen into a single story. And that's not talking to sources. That's rewriting the same freaking sentence over and over again until I feel like it's decent. I watched that movie Get Out. I don't know if you saw it, the horror movie.
No, I've been wanting to see it. But yeah, I know that's the one where Jordan Peele, right?
Yeah, it is. And so I loved it. And one of the things I thought after seeing it, it's incredibly well made, the story's well told, it's innovative, it's super imaginative. And the number of things that he's able to do without showing the seams of what he's doing is incredible. But simply because it's so good, that you're seeing the iceberg tip of so much work and so much thought and so much energy and so much a part of one's life. In fact, a lot of people's lives, because it's not as though one person works on a movie, it's hundreds of people.
It takes a lot of work to make something look effortless and easy.
Oh, yeah.
And I think that's an actual mark of being exceptionally good at your craft. I think that's a big difference between overcomplicated writing when we're younger and getting to a more natural state. I'm sorry, I cut you off.
No, I read a book lately by Jacques Barzan called Simple and Direct. And he basically says that the hardest tone in writing to achieve is the one that is simple, direct, and clear. That is the ultimate goal. And actually, most people never get there.
Yeah.
And that you shouldn't trust yourself with any fireworks or special effects before you're able to reach that level of just simply being clear, communicating what you mean.
It's a crutch.
Which I know sounds so simple.
Yeah.
Right. But it's actually very difficult.
So I want to ask a follow-up question. You talked about your work a little bit and kind of your process. I'm curious to know, has writing for a living, now that you're writing and doing the marketing job, has that had any impact on your creative writing, whether it's been novels or pitching story ideas or anything? Are you finding a bit of a struggle, or have you been able to kind of compartmentalize that stuff and kind of switch modes fairly easily?
I think if anything, it's helped me get better. Writing copy, and the particular kind of copy that I write, it's incredibly simple. You use short sentences. You're trying to write to an 8th grade level. You're trying to write so that anyone could understand you. It's not for a specialized audience.
Anyone, yes.
Yes, absolutely anyone. Someone with a 4th grade education should be able to read your copy and understand what it is and the story you're telling. And you have to maintain interest for about 5,000 words usually. And that's a tall order. So you have to work at it. And when you're writing a 1,000-word article, I think it keeps me from, hopefully, getting lazy and just thinking like, oh, because this interests me, the reader won't mind if I go on about it for 200 words. Right. Now when it comes to things like that, I'm just merciless. Cut it, get it out of the way. Unless it's a general interest and likely to hold someone's attention, then I won't include it. Like, your job is for the reader. You're there to entertain, and they're being nice to you by participating in this. Yeah. So it's made me very reader focused. Sorry, I can put that in a nutshell.
Yeah, no, that's great. It's spoken like a true marketer. You kind of think about your audience a lot more.
Right. Did I sound?
No, and I mean, that is a compliment. It's not a bad thing. I mean, right, we're all writing stuff and creating things because we want it to be read. You have to get over your narcissism at some point. Totally.
That's true. I mean, there's nothing wrong with writing for a specialized audience. I have a lot of friends who are poets. That's not a mass market thing, but I have huge admiration for their work and what they do.
But even to that, right, I'll kind of play devil's advocate a little bit. Even if you're a poet, I mean, unless you're writing poetry and then putting it in a book and locking it away in a trunk, still writing for people to read it. I'm not saying it should be dumbed down or overly accessible, but ultimately we're all writing things to communicate with other people. If it's unintelligible or not interesting, then I think you do yourself a bit of a disservice, because you're not able to form that connection.
I agree. I think that especially in such a crowded world, right, there are dozens of other internet articles you could be reading that are not mine, that I want to reward, or at least my hope is to reward your attention, because this is kind of a mutual venture.
So this brings me to my last real question. So what advice do you have for other people who are creative, no matter whether they're writers or musicians or any kind of creative pursuit that they might follow?
Kind of like what I was saying earlier, I think persist, don't give up, make the time, find the time. You'll like yourself more for it, no matter what you may achieve or not achieve with the art part of things. I think it's important for you and your humanity and maintaining it in a world that doesn't make that easy.
Thank you. Last question we always like to wrap up with. So if people want to read more of what you've read or kind of find out more about you or find some of the stuff that you've been working on, how do they reach you? How do they find you online?
I'm real easy because my last name is really unusual. There's not more than one of me that I've been able to find. Anyway, on Twitter, I'm at Greedzilla1. That's Greedzilla1, and you can find my email address on there, and I love hearing from people, so I say absolutely, send me an email.
I was impressed when you responded to me, because I was like, I have no idea if I'll even get a response. The Twitter handle made me chuck. It wasn't what I expected. I had to double check it once or twice when I found you. I was like, that's right, that's her.
Yeah, that's me. For about 10 minutes, I was trying to be a DJ, and so that was the name, Greedzilla, so...
Nice. See, we didn't even talk about that. So we get all the way to the end, and then you're like, oh, yeah, I was a DJ too.
Well, it's because I was not good.
So. But you've been talking about persistence for so long.
I probably should have put the 10,000 hours into that one.
When you send me photos to help me promote this on social media, can you send me a DJ picture?
Oh, God.
I'm totally joking. I'm totally giving you a hard time. I'm joking. Kat, this has been wonderful. Thank you. I know we definitely ran long. This is one of my longer episodes, but it's for an absolutely good reason. I say this every time, but I really mean this. I really enjoy talking to you. I hope you and I stay in touch. I'd love to kind of chat more, given kind of our similarities, and just kind of stay in touch, given that we've got so much in common. But thank you. I really do mean that. I appreciate you doing this interview and giving me some time this evening to do this.
I've loved it, Alan. You're doing me the favor. And absolutely, let's stay in touch. And if folks want to reach out, I love hearing from people.
Okay.
I work from home, So I'm around. Anyway, yeah, thank you again. I really, really enjoyed this.
Yeah, that sounds good. All right. Well, thanks.
Cool. All right. Chat to you again.
See ya. All right. Thank you, Kat, for doing the interview. I greatly appreciate it. And listeners, I hope you enjoyed the conversation as well. Now, if you like the episode, shoot me an email and let me know. In fact, if you do, to show you my appreciation, I'll send you a few stickers and buttons as my way of saying thanks. Just remember to include your mailing address in your email. You can reach me at headheartandhustle@gmail.com or through our website. You can also get email updates from us, which, are fairly inconsistent, I will admit that. It really depends on how busy my life gets. Visit headheartandhustle.com/newsletter to sign up. Also, remember that you can find us on the web at headheartandhustle.com. We're also on social media on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, and Google+. Our logo for the podcast was created by Meg Shearer, and if you really enjoy it, check out our other work on Society 6. Just look for Meg's stuff. The music you hear each episode was written and performed by the band Starch to Sugar. You can find them at starchtossugar.com and on Facebook. Lastly, if you're interested in being interviewed for a future episode, contact me at headheartandhustle@gmail.com. As always, thanks for listening. Now go create something.